You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering downtown at Third Window Brewing Company on September 24th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. Well, good evening, friends. It's good to be with you at our Dinner and Dialogue Downtown edition here at Third Window. I think many of you know this, but our community actually started here at Third Window, just across the way in that other patio over there. And so it's always fun to be back. Over these past few weeks, we've been on a journey together in this series of conversations we're calling Processing God. We've been stepping up to the edges of what we can say about God. We've been talking about metaphor and mystery and metaphysics. We've also been talking about what we must unsay. We've asked how our lives themselves, our loves and our losses, our thresholds of suffering and joy, open us to new spiritual horizons. We've wondered how language helps us name the unnameable, and how poetry and metaphor sometimes take us further than our logic or our creeds. And so tonight, I want to invite us to take another step. Not to close the conversation, but to open it wider. To ask, if we were to speak of God in 2025, here and now, with what we know of the world and what we've lived through, what might we say? So the idea I want to walk with you in tonight is called process theology. For some of you, this will feel like new terrain. Maybe you've never heard of process theology. For others, it may be a homecoming that you didn't see coming. But for all of us, it's an invitation to imagine God differently, not as a far-off deity pulling the strings, but as a loving companion who is present within us in every moment, luring us toward life. So tonight, we'll talk not just in metaphor, but also in metaphysics, or in other words, how we actually think reality works. So let's pay attention to that register, because my assumption is that those of us who grew up with God likely grew up hearing that God is quote-unquote all-powerful or omnipotent, the one who can do anything at any time. And so tonight, as we talk in this metaphysical register, we're going to do so through our inherited Christian language. And at first, that idea of omnipotence sounds comforting. You know, like somebody's in control. I'm glad because it's not me. And that idea is comforting until we face suffering, until we watch the news and we see war and genocide and violence, until someone we love gets cancer, until we ourselves are bowled over by our own grief. Then the question arises, if God could have stopped this but didn't, what does that say about God? You know, what kind of God would that be? And I don't know about you, but like I described in my own journey of suffering a couple weeks ago, the old explanations started not to sit well anymore. Maybe you've heard them, that when we don't understand the suffering of the world, God's ways are always higher than our ways. God has a plan we can't see, or God allowed this for some mysterious reason. But when you sit beside someone who's just lost someone, or when you live through a pandemic, or when you're trying to make sense of abuse and injustice in the world, those answers don't necessarily heal, do they? Did you know that thinking comes from this verse in Isaiah 55? It's a famous passage that says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, for my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." How many times has that scripture been quoted to justify a God who doesn't stop suffering? But if we read the verses right before it, it helps us to understand what Isaiah was after. Let the wicked forsake their way and let them return to the Lord, that God may have mercy on them, for God will abundantly pardon. So even in that verse, the higher way of God isn't about cold detachment. It's about how abundantly merciful and forgiving God is, overflowing in compassion, as opposed to our human divisions and hurts. So to twist that into an excuse for why God lets horrors happen is, I think, unfortunately, a bad idea and bad theology. So what if God's power isn't about control? What if it's relational and persuasive and invitational instead? That's the heart of process theology. God doesn't force outcomes. God works in every moment through love. not coercive power, but uncontrolling love. You know, my friend Tripp Fuller has a great line. He says that if as a Christian you're going to call your God good, God has to be at least as nice as Jesus. And he uses this babysitter analogy. You know, if a babysitter saw your child run into the street with a car coming and had the power to pull them back but didn't, you'd call them immoral, wouldn't you? Or probably something worse, right? So why would we say a God is good who watches children die in war or famine when God supposedly could stop it? If God really had the power to prevent every tragedy but chose not to, we'd be left with a monstrous God who's complicit in evil. And that doesn't square with Jesus, you know, or with the God of love that many of us have heard about throughout our lives. So another theologian, Thomas J. Ord, who's also a friend of mine, puts it this way. God's nature is love, and God can't act out of character. That means God literally cannot coerce, harm, or abandon. At first, it sounds like we're saying God is less powerful, right? But if we lean in, what we're actually saying is that God's power is love itself, and love, by its nature, cannot force. So how does God act? I sometimes say not like a billiard cue knocking balls into place, right? Not as a puppeteer pulling the strings, but as the one who offers possibilities for beauty and justice and healing in every situation. Possibilities that must be freely embraced by a free world that makes its own decisions. You can think of it like a lure in fishing. You know, you cast it out and it's a draw, it's a magnetism or a whisper pulling the fish toward itself. And God, in that same way, is pulling us toward what is beautiful, good, and true. God is always calling, never coercing. Always present, but never absent. You know, the contemplative teacher Jim Finley says that God protects us from nothing, even as God inexplicably sustains us in all things. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't act. It means that God acts in a way consistent with love. Never by force, but always by presence. And I wonder if we know this from everyday experience. You know, if someone loses an arm at the shoulder, no amount of prayer makes it grow back, does it? If one of us were to be, hiking up to Inspiration Point and we slipped off the side of the cliff, gravity wouldn't pause in midair so we could float back to the top of the ledge. We live in a real world with real consequences, and on some level, we have to use our common sense here. So let's be honest. When we try to defend an all-controlling God, we end up justifying morally troubling ideas. And friends, it's high time we leave those ideas behind. Instead, let's imagine God as the one who never causes evil, but works to squeeze whatever good is possible out of any situation. Not the author of suffering, but the healer present in its aftermath. I actually think that's what Paul was likely getting at in Romans 8:28. You might have heard it as, all things work together for good, which can sound like saying everything, even evil, is somehow good. But other translations read, God makes all things work together for good, or in all things God works for good. And that's a different vision. Evil can still be evil, but God is always the one weaving threads of healing and reconciliation and restoration out of the mess. I wonder if you can recall a time in your own life when you sensed God's presence, not as a rescuer who erased your pain, but as a companion who held you through it. Or maybe you've seen it in someone else, the resilience that rises after loss, the small act of kindness that shifts a whole day, the slow work of justice that refuses to give up. That's what this theology is pointing us toward. God as the ever-present lure toward wholeness, God as a relentless love that never abandons. Tom Oord titled one of his books, God Can't, which I think is a great title. And as you can imagine, it's controversial for some Christians to say that, right? But it's liberating for others. And his claim is that in process theology, God's power is always loving and never violating and working with us in every moment. God can't contradict God's own nature, or God won't override the natural way things operate in our universe, which is love. That means that there are just some situations in the real world, like the arm analogy I told you, or like the slipping off the edge of a cliff, when the kind of activity God performs can't fix the situation. So when tragedy strikes, we don't have to say, God allowed this for some mysterious reason. Rather, we can say, God is with me in this. God did not cause this. God is the one working even here as a fellow sufferer who understands to offer new possibilities out of these circumstances. And at first, this feels like giving something up. And it kind of is. It's giving up control. But in the end, it can be profoundly comforting. Because if God doesn't control every outcome, then God is never the cause of our pain. Instead, God is always for us, always inviting us to join in the work of justice and compassion, always luring creation toward beauty and peace, never coercing, never abandoning. And that, friends, is good news. So here we are in 2025. We live in a world scarred by violence and beauty, by suffering and resilience. We've seen pandemics and wars, and we've also been marked by breathtaking acts of kindness and solidarity. So let me sort of summarize the God purported by process theology. This God never causes cancer, hurricanes, or abuse or injustice. Instead, God is always the healer, never the afflictor. And this can bring deep comfort to those of us who've carried wounds from older images of God. So friends, if you, like me, had ever wondered in a time of great suffering in your own life, not only did God cause this or can God fix this, but also, is God real, or does God still love me, or does God do anything? This theology can be such a gift. I know it has been for me, because when I was first introduced to process theology, I was so excited. I was so excited to learn a new concept of God, so excited to explore the ways in which this theology engages scientific understanding, which we're going to do in a couple of weeks. We're going to look at the actual cosmological side of this. And what I found as I got into it was not only does this theology help me make sense of how God could be good without being morally troublesome, but also this concept of God led me back into a posture of contemplative mysticism. I know that when we were young on the spiritual path, many of us were so earnest about our relationships with God, right? About our devotional lives or about wanting to be a really good person. And I know that many of us perhaps might have lost that sense somewhere along the way as life threw us difficult circumstances. I remember when I was finishing up my final grad program, I wrote a note to my professor who I spent a lot of time with learning about cosmology and philosophy and this theology. And the note pretty much simply said one thing: thanks for giving me God back. And it was so meaningful for me because I think there was this place in me that longed to know if I could find a meaningful spirituality again. I longed to know if there was a deep place of homecoming and safety within me that I could access. And this God beyond the almighty puppet master, the companion in God, was that there, this God at the soul level that was so healing and could be for me in a deep place again. Friends, most of the gods we encounter look a lot like our worst personality traits as human beings. But I want to say to you tonight what I hope is a balm for many of us. God is not the author nor the condoner of your suffering. God calls evil evil. God doesn't hate you if you doubt, or if you're queer, or if you don't fit the mold of Western Christianity. God is the love that runs through every tradition and the big mystery that holds us all. God protects us from nothing, even as God inexplicably sustains us in everything. God can't control every outcome, but God will never stop luring us toward ever new and beautiful expressions of ourselves. Perhaps there is a God who is, in the end, always at least as nice as Jesus. Because if God is in any way love, God is uncontrolling love. All right, I've got 3 contemplative questions for conversation around your tables. The first question is the self question. Think back on your own journey. Have there been times when the image of an all-controlling God stopped being meaningful for you? How did your own common sense or lived experience push you toward imagining God differently? Number 2, the sacred question. If God's power is not coercive, but uncontrolling love, always present, never abandoning, how does that shift the way you experience God's presence in the everyday, or in suffering or joy? And lastly, number 3, the society question. In a world marked by violence, injustice, and beauty all at once, what difference might it make for our communities if we looked to God as a lure toward justice and healing in the wake of all we are going through in our time, rather than as a force that controls outcomes? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.